So in the last unit, we learned that DNA was the genetic material that gets passed down from parent to child and gives instructions about how to make proteins in our cells. And those proteins really give us the appearance that we have. They code for things like the color of our hair and the color of our skin. And they code for other things like how tall we're going to grow, or chemical reactions that happen in our cell, or the protein that causes our cells to have shape. So they really control everything about our body. But we get two sets of genes. We get one from our mom and one from our dad. And so genetics is really about looking at how those genes interact to produce what you really look like. So Gregor Mendel was a monk who lived in the 1800s, and he studied pea plants to learn more about genetics and how things pass from parent to offspring. So hopefully Mendel got all the data that he needed from the pea plants before his friends made pea soup out of it. By the end of the PowerPoint, you should be able to explain how meiosis is related to the principle of independent assortment, and also complete a two-trait Punnett square. So Gregor Mendel was a monk who lived in the 1800s, and here is a picture of him down here tending to his pea plants in the garden. And a couple of things that are important to know about pea plants. First of all, how they reproduce. So flowers are actually the reproductive parts of plants. And there's two important parts inside of that flower that you probably never noticed before. One of them is taller, and that is called the stamen. The stamen is the male part of the flower that contains pollen, and pollen is flower sperm. And there's a shorter part inside that's called the carpel, and that is the female part of the flower. So the way that pea plants reproduce is they generally self-pollinate. Self-pollinate just means that sperm or the pollen from a flower falls onto the carpel of that same flower, and so we call that self-pollination. He also had to be using pea plants that were true breeding, which just means that if they were to reproduce with themselves, they're going to produce offspring that are identical to themselves. And so that way we know exactly what the genetics of that pea plant are. So by looking at one trait, Mendel learned a couple of things. He learned that traits are passed from parents to offspring, which seems kind of obvious, but back in the 18th century or the 19th century, people thought that you got a mixture of your parents' genes. So it kind of mixed up sort of like two different paint colors. But Mendel saw that all of the pea plants that he studied, no matter what trait he looked at, whether he looked at flower color or height or the shape of the peas, he saw all of those traits had one of two different forms. And offspring always had one of the forms from one of their parents, never a mixture. And so he concluded that some alleles or some versions of genes are dominant and others are recessive. Dominant just means that even if you get one allele, that trait is going to show up. So, for example, here we've got two parents that have a big A and a little a. And so what these A's represent are the two genes that this person got from their parents. Whoops. We know that every person gets one set of chromosomes from their mom and one set of chromosomes from their dad. And each of those sets of chromosomes contains every gene. And so you actually have two versions of every gene in your body. So this person got a big A version from their mom and a little a version from their dad. Or it could have been vice versa, we're not really sure. But they have one of each of the two versions. And the capital A represents dominant. And so if this person has even one dominant allele, that allele is going to be the one that this person looks like. or that's the appearance that they're going to have, is the appearance of that particular trait. So it may be something like blonde hair or blue eyes. Um, Most human traits are much more complicated than that, but just to make things simple. He also discovered that during the formation of gametes, alleles for particular traits segregate or separate, and that's what allowed um, the child to get just one gene from the mom and one gene from the dad. So Mendel also asked himself, do traits get passed down together? So does it have to be that all green seeds are also round, or that all wrinkle seeds are also yellow? Or could it be a mixture so that we have some green and round seeds, some yellow and round seeds, some green and wrinkled seeds, some yellow and wrinkled seeds? So in order to determine if that happens, he took a look at two different traits. And instead of just watching one trait as he crossed pea plants, he would look at two traits. So here we've got a true breeding wrinkled and yellow seed and a true breeding round and green seed. And so he crossed them together, and then he knew that the two dominant traits were going to be the two dominant alleles. Those would be the appearance of the offspring. So he saw that the round trait showed up and the yellow trait showed up, and so these two traits are dominant. We would say that round is dominant over wrinkled, and yellow is dominant over green. So then he took these two pea plants, and he crossed them with each other. And so what he ended up getting was some peas that were round and yellow, some peas that were green and round, some that were wrinkled and yellow, and some that were green and wrinkled. So because there were all four combinations, that we didn't just have yellow and wrinkled or green and round like the parents, he said that these two traits assorted independently. So this diagram is called a dihybrid cross or a two-trait cross. And it shows what happens when we look at two traits from plants that are being crossed. So the way that you complete a dihybrid cross is you look at the genes that the parents have. So this parent has a big R and a little r, and a big Y and a little y. And so it's almost like the FOIL method to combine one of those letters from each pair to create the alleles that are going to be found in gametes. So you take the big R and you distribute it, and you get big R and big Y. So that's the allele combination right here. And then you do big R and little y. So that's the next allele combination. And then you take the second letter of the first trait, so little r, and combine it with big Y. And that's the one over here. And then little y and little r. And that goes up here. And it doesn't really matter the order of the allele combinations up here as long as you have the correct combination so that you distribute each of them. And we know that the second parent has exactly the same genetics as the first parent. So these are the traits, these are the alleles that the second parent has as well. So a big R and a big Y, a big R and a little y, little r, big Y, little r, little y. And those are the gametes along the side. And then we're going to do the same thing we did for one trait cross, where we bring across all of the letters for the different alleles, and then we're going to bring down the letters as well. So in this first box, for example, we bring across a big R, and we bring down to big R. We bring across a big Y and down to big Y, and so we get that this plant is going to be round with yellow seeds. And so we're going to continue to do that for each of the boxes, and you should end up with 9 of the plants that have two dominant traits, 3 of the plants that have one of the dominant traits, 3 of the plants that have the other dominant trait, and 1 plant that has both recessive traits. So there's 4 things that Mendel learned from doing his research. A couple of them we've looked at already. So the inheritance of biological characteristics is determined by individual units known as genes, and genes are passed from parents to offspring. And so through further research, we now know that genes are actually short segments of DNA. Mendel didn't know that, but that's what we know now. He also learned that in the case where 2 or more forms of genes exist, so we call those different forms alleles, some of those forms may be dominant and others may be recessive. So dominant just meaning that it has the ability to mask other genes, and recessive meaning it does not have the ability to mask other genes. The third thing that he learned was that in most sexually reproducing organisms, each adult has 2 copies of every gene, 1 from each parent. We learned about that when we looked at meiosis. And so these genes are segregated from each other when gametes are formed through the process of meiosis. And let's pull this down a little bit further. And so then alleles for different genes usually segregate independent of each other. So let's look at why exactly that happens. So independent assortment happens because of what goes on during meiosis. So if you remember, meiosis happens when we're forming gametes, and there's 2 divisions. We start out with a diploid cell with 2 copies of every chromosome, and the way that those chromosomes line up during metaphase 1 is random. So blue chromosomes are one that this person got from their father, and red chromosomes are ones that this person got from their mother. And it could be that the chromosomes line up so that all the blue ones are on one side and all the red ones are on the other. Or they could line up so that there's 1 blue and 1 red on each side. It's random which way they're going to line up. So this is really the principle of independent assortment. The fact that it's random which way the chromosomes are going to line up. So then if we follow these chromosomes through the rest of meiosis, now the homologous pairs are going to split. So you see that this gamete gets all the blue ones, this gamete gets all the red ones. Or if we go with the other option, then we've got a blue and a red in each of the 2 gametes. And then in meiosis 2, these chromosomes will actually split in half. And so we end up with 4 gametes here, 1 with all blue, or 2 of them have all blue chromosomes, 2 of them have all red chromosomes, and here we've got 4 with each 1 blue and 1 red. This doesn't consider the possibility of crossing over, so it's a little bit simplistic. But what it does show very nicely is that chromosomes assort independently. Just because 1 blue chromosome stays on this side doesn't mean they're both going to stay on this side. They sort of do their own thing. So how this relates to the traits that Mendel looked at before is, imagine this larger chromosome has the traits for being yellow versus green, and the smaller chromosome has the traits for being wrinkled versus round. Well, it could be that wrinkled and yellow stay together, or that wrinkled and yellow get separated. And so it's possible to create any of the 4 combinations that we saw in, let's go back, any of the 4 combinations that we saw in this Punnett square. So just for practice, I want you to try making a Punnett square where you're crossing one of these F1 yellow pea plants. So remember, this is the genotype for those pea plants. And then try crossing it with a green pea with the genotype big R, little y, little y.